Oh, you've read the whole thing?
You gotta run out.
Oh, well, I've read only from time to time in my life, I've read excerpts from it. Now, after teaching once, I went out and did a Wikipedia search for it and read some highlights. I mean, there is the story of, but there is well, actually, we could spend a whole semester talking about the Iliad.
And the Romans also, when they made a national story, they made the Aeneid, which was an opera of the Iliad and Odyssey.
The Romans, yeah.
With the Trojans, some of the Trojans escaped, and they were going to start the Roman Empire, and they came back to get the Greeks after like a certain amount, there was like 1,000 years.
I've heard that's part of the story too, that some of the Trojans escaped and went off to Italy and built the Roman Empire that eventually conquered the Greeks. They had incentive to do that. Yeah, that's part of it also. It is known that a lot of Greeks wound up settling in Italy, which we will mention in a few minutes. Anyway, if Greece was united, or if Greece were united during the time of the Iliad and Odyssey, by the time that history begins, they were not. Now, Greek history as we know it begins with a script called Linear B. And again, I don't know if your book mentions that or not. Anyway, Linear B was written in a style that was hard to read, but we now know that Linear B was Greek, because the writing is Greek. But eventually, the Greeks adopted the Phoenician alphabet, and from there, Greek history begins. The Phoenicians taught the Greeks their alphabet, and the Greeks said, hey, this is better than the way we're writing. And the Greeks then began to keep written records. And the rest, they say, is history. I've already mentioned the polis, this Greek city-state. The polis was usually an area between mountains. When you had your mountains, and the typical polis was surrounded by high, ragged, jagged mountains that protected them from their enemies and made it difficult for enemies to cross. And each polis had varied in size, but it was the polis was the city surrounded with its walls, with the surrounding countryside where the farmers lived and grew the crops that the city needed. So you had many different polises. The most important ones of them, though, were Athens and Sparta, and eventually Thebes and Corinth. There were many and numerous other ones, but which we could talk about if we had more time. But the main ones were Athens and Sparta. It said that Athens had a population about 250,000 by 400 BCE, but most of your polis were much smaller, consisted maybe of a few hundred to several thousand persons. The Greeks, his whole life was centered around his polis. Aristotle said the polis meets the Greek when he is first born. He lives in it, fights for it, and ultimately dies in it. It was like he belonged to the state, belonged to the polis. In some ways, the polis was even more important than the individual. If persons who study military history will ever come to the term hoplite, the Greeks developed this system of fighting, and for a time it tended to make war a little bit safer. Essentially, the Greek soldiers would line up shoulder to shoulder. And instead of protecting themselves, now, you may know I'm left-handed, but most people are right-handed. So for right now, I'm going to pretend that I'm right-handed. But most people would protect themselves with their own shield. Instead, the Greek soldier would extend his arm out. He'd protect his buddy beside him with his shield. And in turn, he'd be protected by the man beside him. So he'd fight with his sword in his right hand, protected by his buddy's shield. In turn, he'd protect. And the idea was to have a solid wall. You did not fight a Greek soldier individually, a Greek hoplite. You had to fight the whole team. So if you approached them They all, yes.
Was this the concept of, what is it called?
Roman
The
phalanx?
machine that, the big machine that has the gun.
You're talking about
and goes around?
The catapult, the big, oh, wait, no.
No.
Oh, the machines that would,
Yeah, the machines that have guns and will roll around.
tanks, the Greeks did develop something that resembled a tank, but they did not catch on. No, they did not use guns at this time.
No, they created a human tank, like, created a human tank with their,
You know, put a wall on wheels and carry the wall toward the enemy.
no, using their own, like, they would create, as you said, they would create a wall with.
The wall was the wall of shields.
Yeah.
Yeah, men, yeah, the wall. Notice when the Greek army approached you, what you would see is a wall of shields all in an even line, and they would march in some kind of formation. And this is where the army troops, even in the modern times, get out here marching. The left foot goes first, and they would all march in formation. And the wall of shield might be about 4 or 5 men deep. And if the man in front was killed, the man behind him would step up and take his place. And now these walls of hoplites had a tendency to go drift to the right. In other words, if the man beside you was killed, you would find yourself unprotected, so you'd kind of drift to the right. So they would drift to the right, but they had a couple of weaknesses. Number one, the Greek hoplites only wore armor in their front. Their backs were unprotected. The idea was wearing armor in the back would weigh you down too greatly, so you really would need to protect. You had to keep the enemy in front of you. A hoplite formation could be defeated if you could outflank them. Hence, you get around their right or around their left or get behind them somehow, you could defeat them. But it was very difficult to defeat as long as they stayed in formation, and they were well disciplined. But because of this tendency for the enemy to try to outflank them, the Greeks would put their very best, strongest troops at the right or left flank, particularly their right flank, because these armies had a tendency to go to the right, so they put their best troops on their right flank, and it was considered an honor to be put on the flank to protect your buddies who were fighting in the center. And this type of fighting did result in a reduced number of casualties because, again, it was difficult to kill a man who was part of a solid wall of shields. Even though obviously in wartime a few persons were killed. But it did result in fewer casualties. But a lot of the injuries were to the throat and the groin. And a lot of people did not like this way of fighting. And of course it eventually became obsolete when armies got bigger. The hoplite depended on the soldier being able to hear his commander's voice. When armies got bigger, no commander could shout loudly enough to be heard by, a 80 or 90,000 man army. But these hoplites fighting, this hoplite was good as long as armies consisted of only a few thousand men. Also, they were not effective against horsemen. The Greeks did not have a whole lot of horsemen, owing to the fact that their terrain, a horse requires a large open amount of pasture land, which the Greeks simply did not have. So the Greeks were not horsemen. The wealthier ones of them had a few horses. They were not cattlemen. They were not ranchers. They were not herdsmen. But they were farmers, particularly one of their main crops was olives. Anyway, the hoplite unit was called a phalanx, and your book shows a picture of it on page 98, 2 phalanx units jumping at each other, and again you can see the shields forming somewhat of a solid wall, and the trumpeter at the back on one side trumpeting out some kind of command. The soldiers had to learn what each trumpet blast meant. This trumpet blast meant advance, or another trumpet blast would mean retreat. The Greeks were to fight their wars this way for several hundred years. Then, eventually, as I've already mentioned, the Greeks would develop rule by tyrants. Now, the word tyrant today always has a bad connotation. At this time, they sometimes consider the tyrant to be the good man, the man who brought order out of chaos, or the man who could control them and keep them in line. Oligarchs were a few rich people ruled by a few, and eventually these oligarchs would lead to a democracy, which oftentimes failed. All right, this takes us up to the conflict between Athens and Sparta. Two main city-states. Your book starts off talking about Sparta, so we will. And several of you, I'm impressed by how many students I've found in these two classes who are interested in Sparta. But anyway, Sparta. When I was a youngster, the big world conflict was a conflict between two superpowers, the United States on one hand and the Soviet Union on the other. And I would think when I was a kid, the conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union reminds me of the conflict between Athens and Sparta. There was one bad side of that. I mean, the United States being Athens, the Soviet Union being Sparta. Initially, Sparta won. Notice it said initially. Now, in the long run, the city of Sparta ceased to exist. There have been a few books written. One of them called 1984, written about in 1954, about a structured society. Brave New World, again, Huxley, a structured society. But Sparta was a structured society. The people of Sparta enslaved the nearby Messenians, by the way, who claimed to be descended from Hercules. But anyway, these Messenians were put to forced labor and enslaved, and they were to supply the food the Spartans needed. After a while, the Messenians revolted. In fact, several times in history, the Messenians revolted, and the revolts were put down for several generations. But the Spartans, to make sure they kept the Messenians in line, required that everybody in Sparta be a soldier. The king was a soldier. Actually had two kings. It's believed that at one time Sparta consisted of two communities that eventually joined together, so they had two kings. The king and all the nobility were soldiers, and from the time a person was born, he was expected to be a soldier. Now, when a Spartan couple had a baby, the Spartan couple were allowed to keep that baby for 1 month. And at the end of the month, that baby was to be examined by Spartan doctors. If the baby appeared healthy, he was allowed to grow up. If the baby appeared weak, the parents were expected to take the baby out to a remote place. It was called exposing, and let the baby starve to death. I mean, folk, it may sound unpleasant. This was an unpleasant fact of life in the ancient world. A lot of ancient peoples exposed their babies. And in fact, the city of Rome may have been founded by two young twin boys who were exposed, but who managed to grow up anyway. We'll talk more about that in the next chapter. But the Spartans guaranteed then, supposedly guaranteed that only the strong grew up. Military training began at age 6. Instead of going to school, the young boys were taken with their parents and put into a military camp. And there, they were given some really, really strict regimen and discipline. They were fed very little. And they were told, any other food you get, you have to steal, but don't get caught. The idea was to steal what you need to, but if you're caught, you're whipped. Whipping was a big part of the military regimen, and every Spartan boy was whipped in public at least once a year. The whole idea was to toughen them up and harden them up and get them prepared for the rigors of battle. And they believed that deprivation was the main way to prepare oneself, to toughen oneself up. Their people were discouraged from visiting people from other cities, and other cities were discouraged from coming to visit them. They said, we don't want to have anything to do with art and music or friendships. Friendships are weaken persons. Art makes a person soft and weak. Music does the same thing. Again, in no way do I teach any of this except to say that the Spartans believed it. In fact, Aristotle said the Spartans tried only to make a man a soldier, and the result is they make him a poor human being as well as a poor soldier. But their lives were regimented. When they were 30, Well, they were expected to marry when they were in their 20s, but they lived in a barracks until they were 30, and if they ever saw their wives between the time they married and the time they turned 30, they had to sneak off from the barracks and visit their wives. And all this was to contribute to the downfall because, needless to say, their population did not increase very fast. Between exposing their babies and having a high percentage of their young boys die taking military training, and then not allowing their young men to visit their wives, and then later an economic policy where Spartan parents were expected to pay for the military training the state was to give them, and Spartan couples decided, well, we can't afford this, so Spartan couples started not having children. All this was to contribute to a big downturn in the Spartan population that ultimately led to their near extinction. All right.